My topic is historic Pikes Peak regional floods, recovering and learning from them. I'm a kind of a history buff, for one thing, but I've spent 43 years in the insurance business. And it seems like flooding and insurance and history all go together. When I first got into this, I was really only aware of about 3 to 4 floods. The first flood, of course, was the 1935 flood, and then the 1965 flood, and then in my lifetime here in Colorado Springs, there was a near flood situation in 1999. I think the earliest flood that I've seen is back to 1884. And there's, none of them are really big, but I would classify the 3 that I just told you and amongst the bigger ones. Probably you should throw in at the same time the flood from 1921 that basically wiped out Pueblo, because the waters that went and caused that damage came through here. The 1935 flood is probably the granddaddy of them all. I read some statistic which basically said that if you were to put the floodwaters over the Cimarron overpass of the I-25, it would be about 12 feet higher than that. First of all, I have a hard time getting my hands around that because it's so massive. But the fact remains is that water of that depth not only damaged houses, life was lost, bridges were lost. I think the Uinta Bridge was lost. I believe the Bijou Bridge was lost. And so it had major impacts, that particular flood. For most of us, because we live in an arid climate, picturing this much water is just very difficult unless you've actually lived it, been there, done that. Most of the snowmelt, since we're in a dry area of the state, most of the flooding snowmelt tends to be on the west slope of the Rockies, and so while Pikes Peak has its fair share of snow, it's not necessarily a big source of flooding. But what happens is, and we've seen a whole bunch of these, is this weather phenomenon. I'm still trying to get my hands around how this happens. But basically, they call them cloudbursts, and or if it's not a cloudburst, it's a storm that hangs up over the Rockies, basically, and dumps massive amounts of rain. And then again, because of the elevation in which it's falling on and the diverse elevation that it's falling on, the fact that there's not a lot of trees to break it up in many instances, the fact that now we have in Colorado Springs, one of the changes in the springs is we've got a lot more urbanization that's gone on. And what's going to absorb it? Not the house, not the road. So where's it all going to go? Down the storm sewers and down the floodways and all this kind of stuff. So the next one could be rather interesting. It's hard to know, what this region would have been like had they not had these 2 major catastrophes that wiped out various parts of the city, and they had to go back in and rebuild. And one of the first floods that caused major damage was during the Depression, when times were tougher anyway. So certainly it has an impact. The question is whether it's a permanent impact. And what's interesting about the humankind is that we're very resilient, and so we come back from these things. But there's no question that it puts a little bit of a damper on perhaps some of the economic development that could have occurred. As I understand it, the Templeton Gap Floodway was built to try to avoid flooding down Shook's Run. So what they did is they basically, it's a levee, and they built this levee, as you see along Union, and threw the water into the Monument Creek up further, with the presumption that this would save the Shook's Run, kind of the old East Colorado Springs, from further flooding. When I first came here in 1970, I saw this great big ditch because I lived right by it. And I'm thinking to myself, why do we have that here? What would that ever do? Well, I've learned in the summer of 1970 that ditch can fill up with water. It did. One bad thunder shower, and I've never seen a ditch go from nothing to so much water in a hurry. So I know it's possible. So then what happened? That's 1970. Let's fast forward to the first part of the 21st century. Trees start growing, and it gets silted in over time and all this kind of stuff. And the city came up with a plan to rejuvenate or to dig out and prepare so that it didn't cause further problems. But there was a tax initiative that didn't pass, and that was one of the items that went. So the question then becomes whether or not this one lack of funding we'll learn to live to regret it. And of course the question is, who regrets it? We're all becoming more aware, both in the insurance industry but the average person as well, that something is going on with our weather. And if in fact we are entering a time period where we're going to have much more how shall we say, extreme weather, it probably is a topic that we need to take another look at, both from a historical standpoint, but also going forward, is to figure out how we're going to deal with that, because I'm not sure dealing with it in the future is going to be the same as we've dealt with it in the past. It's just fascinating to see that this is not an isolated or a unique situation. It's a situation that has happened and probably will happen again. I've attended about the past 5 history symposiums. I find them absolutely fascinating. I've never been a presenter in any of them, but this time that'll change. I think it's important to have these for a couple of reasons. One, for just taking the time to preserve these little events in our local history, for starters. Secondly, and more significantly, there's a bunch of people in this town that weren't here during those times, myself included. I didn't live through either of the two. First of all, I'm not old enough to live through the 1935, but I would have been around had I been living here in 1965. And I'm kind of fascinated with what the Springs was like before I got here, because it was a whole different town. So it was a whole different town when I came here in 1970 than it is now. So I think it's important to preserve that information. And at some point in time, people, when they are looking back on their ancestors in the Pikes Peak region, are going to want to know about some of the things that they went through. And this is an opportunity to kind of synergize the historical and the genealogical incidents that occurred in a certain time frame or time frames, so that it'll be helpful to posterity.